you. Before we introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Deirdre Brock, MP for Edinburgh North and Leith, I would like to say a brief word about the life of Deirdre up until now. Born in Australia, and she grew up in Perth. She did a BA at university in English. And I might be letting a little cat out of the bag here, but our Deirdre was an actress in Home and Away at one time.
Very, very short period.
Yeah. During a visit to Scotland, she met her partner and moved here a year later. Became an assistant to an SNP MSP in Edinburgh, and won the hearts of her constituents. 2007 elected as a councillor, and 2012 re-elected again, and in 2015 she was one of our MPs that won the landslide. 40% of her votes went to Westminster to give Scotland a voice. So a warm welcome to Deirdre, please.
Well, thank you so much for asking me along tonight. I really appreciate it, and particularly I've not been to Milngavie before, to my shame, so it's a beautiful place. So I'm really honoured that you asked me, and thank you very much. And I'm glad you kind of noticed some of the work that myself and my team have been doing around the Scotland office. I'll just maybe start with a few little quick reminders about the Scotland office. In its 16-17 report, the costs of running the Scotland office stood at around £10 million. And remember, that skimmed off the block grant that is given from the UK government to the Scottish government. So on its way, it goes via the Scottish Secretary. He takes money for his needs, and then the rest is given to the Scottish government. In that £10 million, over 850,000 is spent on accommodation, so that's renting and occupying plush offices in Dover House and in Melville Crescent in Edinburgh. And these are some of the questions, I'll be touching on this later, 700,000 at present on spin doctors. That's an enormous increase since 2010. 61,000 on events in the last year or so, and many thousands on social media as well. And you will know, of course, that they have hardly any governing responsibilities now. Well, they might have been useful in the Brexit bill debate, but of course Mr Mundell wasn't even around for that, to defend our rights and responsibilities for the Scottish Parliament. Instead of bringing forward those amendments to the bill that he promised, and certainly Scottish Tories, I think, promised their constituents, those who contacted them about this, instead of doing that, he ummed and he ahed and he delayed until it was too late, and then amendments could only be done through the House of Lords. I am privileged, really, to sit on the Scottish Affairs Committee, along with my colleague Pete Wishart, who's the convener, and Tommy Shepherd. We are the three SNP colleagues. We're somewhat outnumbered by the union supporting MPs in that group. But it is a privilege to be able to get to ask on your behalf the sorts of questions that I know a lot of you want to ask. So I asked Mr Mundell at a meeting why his spin doctor costs had gone through the roof. And he came back with, it's all the fault of the Scottish Government agitating for an independence referendum. And, of course, they were needed for implementing the Smith Commission recommendations. Now, he didn't explain why he needed spin doctors to do that. I have absolutely no idea why they'd be involved in that at all. I read a piece by Helen Liddell. She was reminiscing about her time as Scottish Secretary, and she said when she took over in that department at around the time of devolution, the Parliament getting up and running, there were apparently 5 people in that office. There are now 71 staff, just in Mr Mundell's area, and 50 in the Advocate General's as well, so around about 120 staff positions there. So those are just a few little things to set the scene. But I wanted to go in really about sort of where I started examining some of the social media issues, because it did get quite a lot of attention. You might have read about it in the National and other papers as well. But it was really in the first half of 2017, in the run-up to Scotland's council elections and the snap general election, I noticed something about the Scotland Office's Twitter and Facebook social media accounts. Both of them just seemed a bit odd. I couldn't quite get what it was that was bothering me, but I was twitching a bit and thinking there was something definitely odd going on. You know that feeling when you just can't quite put your finger on it, but it scratches away in your brain. Well, I was sitting one Saturday night. It had been quite a difficult week. I don't like London at the best of times. I certainly don't like Westminster, but this had been a pretty gruelling week. I'd caught the last train home on Thursday. My partner picked me up, Dougie, had picked me up at the station, got home just before midnight, and then had a busy constituency day on the Friday, and then a couple of community events on the Saturday. So I hope you'll forgive me when I tell you that I was sitting back with a glass of wine while my partner prepared some dinner and was actually getting my daughter to help him. So I'm sitting there, lovely smells surrounding me, enjoying a bit of music on the stereo, it suddenly hit me. Everything that I had read on those Scotland Office social media feeds read like an advert. Everything looked like an advert. Nothing looked like someone was writing it off the cuff. It was all very carefully polished and presented, made to look very swish, and it occurred to me was probably very expensive. There'd be tweets about how Scotland got this from the UK or needed this from the UK. There'd be retweets of MOD tweets, or differed tweets, or the Prime Minister's thoughts, or the Foreign Office. There was nothing of anyone responding to a comment. No one behind that account was mentioning anything that was happening as it was happening. I mean, there was an enormous amount that was going on that the Scotland Office should have been interested in, but it didn't seem to be engaged at all. So I grabbed the iPad, started looking at the feeds. I'm pacing back and forward, muttering to myself. My daughter, if you've ever had a teenage daughter, you'll understand this. I heard my daughter saying, "She's off again, Dad." Then we had tea, which was delicious, by the way. My partner's a very good cook. And I sent a message to one of my constituency team, asking if he would look at the Scotland Office feeds and tell me what he thought. And he replied a tad stilted, which is rather typical of my office. I don't use 3 words when one will do. But come the Monday, I thought I had something that really needed looking into. So I started asking questions, written parliamentary questions, of David Mundell and his social media team. And I'd already pulled up some stuff from him about his spin doctor team. His spending on spin doctors, as I mentioned, had quadrupled between 2010 and 2015. It went up again last year. And this year, it's going to be 7.5 times as much as it was 8 years ago. So that's £750,000 on his communications team this year, £750,000. Nothing to do, I'm sure, with the fact that the SNP government got in 2011 on a promise of a referendum on independence. I doubt there's no connection there at all. So anyway, you can probably guess why I was suspicious. So I started asking questions. I got some very interesting answers. The Scotland Office, the branch office of the UK Tory government, I would contend is using Twitter and Facebook for political purposes. Ministers are using expensive promotions to target specific groups of people, and they are paying for it with public money, our money. The Scotland Office advertising costs had been a couple of £100 each month until March 2017, when it shot up to nearly £12,000. That was just before the UK snap general election was called, that no one knew about, of course, and only a couple of months before Scotland's council elections. So the increase between January of last year and March, basically the time when the government has to stop saying things and enter purdah, was about 2,500%. Huge. Now, advertising by governments is valid and it is important, I get that, but this was all spent on targeted messages on Facebook and Twitter. No newspaper adverts, no radio, telly, magazine, cinema or billboard adverts, just social media. And when I asked who was targeted, the answers were at best vague, and he wouldn't show me the adverts used because they'd already been published. Now, we tried to find those adverts. I can tell you they're not easy to track down. We actually asked if they'd publish it in the Commons Library, but they refused. So, happily though, a couple of Ferret Scotland journalists started digging too, and after having to take the Scotland office to the Information Commissioner to get these answers out of them, they discovered that very specific groups had been targeted. People with an interest in RAF Lossiemouth, for example, which of course is in the constituency that Angus Robertson represented at the time that this was going on. And women who didn't go to university, a key Tory target demographic for their party campaigns. They also discovered that one of the advertising campaigns was conducted entirely in David Mundell's constituency. A huge amount of money spent in his constituency, government money, our money, all concentrated in that one area. There was another Scotland Office social media advertising campaign, you might have heard of this, that excluded people interested in Scottish independence. Not just those supporting independence, anyone interested in the subject was excluded. Now, having said that, I believe, or I'm told, that social media companies are more likely to notice your interest in independence if you're a supporter rather than an opposer, so it was excluding mainly yeses. So advertising campaigns limited to people who use Facebook or Twitter, but excluding at least half of the population, is a rather narrow field. So I then asked what advertising had that no independence filter. I was told that it was the Scotland's Trade campaign in 2017. Why exclude Scottish independent supporters, for the main, from an advertising campaign about Scotland's trade? Surely independent supporters are just as interested in trade as anyone else. Well, that campaign tried to persuade people that trade with the UK was more important to Scotland than trade with the EU. I would contend that that was a political point to counter the support of the SNP and the Scottish Government for Scotland's links with the EU. I suppose he didn't want independent supporters coming out and countering that in some way. Now, I do not have a problem with politicians making political points, of course, but they shouldn't be using public money to mount a targeted advertising campaign when their arguments are failing. If the Tories want to pretend to people that our trade with England would collapse after independence and that the EU isn't all that important as a market, then they should carry on. But in my opinion, and I'm guessing yours as well, they should be using their own money to do that, not ours. We should be able to expect that government ministers would be saying the same thing to everyone, no matter what their personal opinion on political matters or constitutional preferences. What Mr. Mundell has been doing, I would contend, is presenting one face to one group of people and a different face to another group, trying to influence people without letting on that they've actually been targeted. I think we should expect more from government ministers. We should be able to expect consistency and forthright discussion. We should be able to expect that they'll be open about what they're doing in their ministerial roles and in what they are saying to different groups of people. We should be able to trust in what they say. And then there's that campaign I mentioned that was run entirely in David Mundell's constituency at public expense. It was supposedly advertising a visit of the UK government's Exporting is Great campaign bus to Gretna. Now that bus went to lots of other places, and the Scotland Office Facebook page had posts about those visits, but it was only when it visited Gretna that money was spent on advertising, and that advertising was aimed at small business owners in the area, another key Tory target demographic hit with the advertising paid for by us. So it's clear to me that the Scotland Office has been using taxpayers' cash to target voters with specific messages. It's also very clear they did not want to tell us about it. I started asking those questions in June of last year, and I only got the answer about independent supporters very recently. I'm certain that there is much more to find, and I'll certainly be digging to try to winkle it out. It would be better all round, though, wouldn't it, if the Scottish Secretary actually fessed up and told us what he's been up to with the social media advertising. Thousands of pounds spent just before an election or elections on targeted campaigns stinks to high heaven. I have a few more just quick points to make, which I thought you might find of interest, which are some of the other things that we've uncovered as a result of questions I've been putting in. So I asked a question April of this year regarding FOI questions. We noticed that since the 21st of August 2014, the Scotland Office has chosen not to publish the FOI questions and answers it's received or given. And when I asked why that was, they told me there's no obligation to do that, and they were reviewing the publication of those. Now, it seems to me a review lasting nearly 4 years has something to answer for in itself, so I'll be pursuing that. We asked questions about the hospitality spend to other departments. I won't go through the whole long list of them. Some of them said it was too expensive to try and collate and so on. But digital, so I remember it was 61,000 for the Scotland office, and digital culture, media and sport, which you'd expect to be spending quite a bit on events and hospitality, given the nature of their business, was only 31,000 in 2016-17. The Welsh office, when we asked them what they spent on hospitality, in the 5 years since 2012, so 2012 to 2017, spent a grand total of £8,439. And in 4 of those 5 years, the Welsh office actually spent nothing on hospitality. Although, to be fair, the Foreign Office actually reported that it had spent $9,387,000 or thereabouts. And given the disaster of Brexit, I would hardly expect that to be going down anytime soon, as the government scurries around the world trying to grub up trade deals for itself. I would also point out that the Scotland's, they very helpfully answered a question I asked them about, how they were targeting, what they were choosing, how they were deciding their choices in targets, and they helpfully provided me with a comment that the Scotland Office's media strategy is to support the core objectives in the single departmental plan, those being mainly or significantly 1, strengthening and sustaining the union, 2, Scotland's voice in Whitehall. I'll leave it to you to decide whether you're doing a good job at that one. And 3, championing the UK government in Scotland. There are 2 other areas I will be keeping a close eye on. One of those is the Borderlands Initiative. I don't know if you've heard of that. It was supposedly some joint working between local authorities either side of the border in England and Scotland. And, given the border's history and the fact that the border for a long time was not clearly established, shall we say, I think that was a reasonable sort of prospect, and certainly some sort of cross-border working would have been appropriate. But to my point of view, from what I've seen, it's basically been hijacked by the UK government and its willing helpers in the form of Scottish Tory border MPs such as John Lamont. Now, they claim it's just to strengthen links between the English and the Scottish sides. I personally think they're making every attempt to try and smudge the border. I think this is sort of in keeping with the frequent comments that we hear that we're all the same, and there's nothing really that divides us. I mean, it would, for me, fit in very much with that particular line of thought that we hear pursued quite a lot. They've just appointed a Borderlands champion, actually, John Stevenson, who has Scottish connections, actually, but represents, I think it's Carlisle. In fact, one might argue that perhaps the next conclusion they'll reach is, why have any sort of border at all? Now, I hope I'm not being too alarmist, but when one's down there, you do start picking up all sorts of little hints, and there are times when sometimes it just seems to add up. I'm nearly finished, and then we'll get to questions. And secondly, the formation of a giant UK government hub in Edinburgh. Now, this is ostensibly to provide a home for many hundreds of staff who are having to leave the various offices that HMRC are closing around Scotland, and they're being concentrated in hubs in principally Glasgow and Edinburgh. But there is certainly space in there for further staff. So far that's another question I've been asking. So far they've refused to give us any details, but I'm certainly, basically we get replies back saying all in good time when we say so. But I will certainly be keeping a very close eye on that issue as well. So the question remains, with an enormous decrease in its responsibilities since devolution and following Mr Mundell's frankly woeful performance generally, but particularly in regard to the Brexit bill and standing up for Scotland's best interests in the UK Cabinet, a T-boy rather than Scotland's man in number 10, who wasn't even invited to that famous Chequers meeting, which some of you might have seen. He wasn't even there. I mean, that was shocking to me, that, you know, a government that claims to care so much about what happens in this country and the precious, precious union didn't even think that perhaps someone like Mr Mundell should have been invited along to represent Scottish interests. Anyway, so it is, from my point of view, and I know from many in the parties, unquestionably time that this post was abolished, and that £10 million is returned to where it will actually do some good to the Scottish Government, to be spent in the best interests and needs of the people of Scotland. You know, we've got a really hard job ahead of us. Let's not fool ourselves. They've got a big slog getting around the front doors, gala days, fetes, telephone numbers that separate this country from independence. But that is certainly one point I will be making loud and clear as I do that. Its days are over. If you know anything of the history of the Scotland office, come and speak to me. I'm happy to talk to you about it, because it's been actually fascinating. In the run-up to tonight, I've been doing a bit of background about, you know, it was in its day useful to the people of Scotland, but it has outgrown that. It is no longer of any use. We have a government who are genuinely interested in looking after the needs of people of Scotland, and we know who we trust to do that for us. But don't forget, the other side will be fighting dirty all the way, and it's clear from some of the work I've been doing, and my colleagues as well, that they will have absolutely no qualms about breaking the rules, we've already seen this, and using public money to do that. So I've just started, really. We are going to keep digging away at this. We will not let them go. Mr Mundell will be appearing before the Scottish Affairs Committee again once their new annual report comes out later on in the year, so I look forward to that prospect, and I encourage you all to tune in, because I'm sure it will be an interesting session. But, as I say, I've just started, and if they think that they can shake us off easily, then they have another think coming. Thank you. Could I ask this gentleman first, because he put his hand up before? I'm sorry.
When you were dealing with this,
Do you want me to stand up?
this cross-border
Yeah.
business, did Rory Stewart feature in it? Yes.
Well, not yet, but I mean, obviously he has been.
Yes.
You'll be aware of Rory Stewart and his,
Yes.
what is it called, Shadowland or some sort of nonsense.
That's it.
I'm just suspicious of it, and I'm suspicious of the fact that so many of these border MPs have sort of jumped onto this Borderland initiative. Although it started actually, I think, in the Cameron administration, this started getting going. It wasn't really going anywhere. It seemed that the local authorities on either side of the border, frankly, were not really that bothered about it. But it seems to me that it's been a really big push from this current government.
Yeah. There was, many years ago, there was an ad hoc arrangement, I think it was called, or something for the eastern borders, but it was, it came from the, I think the Peel Service, I don't know the details, but I do remember they did feature that, but the central government didn't have any input, I don't think, in it.
Right. Mm. No, I didn't know about that. I'll go and I'll do a bit of research on it. Good, thank you very much.
Scott Bamford, Clacks East Branch.
Oh,
Here's a visitor. I was just really wanting to thank you for giving us that talk and also appreciate, obviously, from probably the local branch here, also Clacks East, all the hard work you do in Westminster. And again, appreciate it's a horrible place to be. It's bad circumstances all around, but digging around and doing all that's invaluable, as we know. And also, the social media thing is going to be even bigger come the next independence referendum. It was huge last time, and I think we appreciate just how big it was, particularly from the other side, being able to use it effectively. We know we've got to use it effectively without breaking the rules, and we don't have to because we've got people on our side. So hopefully you won't be down there for too much longer, for good reasons.
Well, I know. I mean, this is always my point. We're down there to do ourselves out of the job. So it's an unusual job in that, I suppose, but we're all really proud to be down there, and honestly, everyone works their socks off. Everyone. I'm so proud of my colleagues. I mean, they're a brilliant bunch of people, and we still have a real closeness, which I think a lot of the other parties still can't quite understand, frankly, especially when you look at them nowadays, Labour and the Tories. I mean, they're just tearing themselves to pieces in many ways. So, thankfully, because we have a purpose, I think that's one of the things that really distinguishes us. We're there to represent people of Scotland's interests and to further the cause of independence, and that drives us all the time. Yes?
Is there anything we can do to make things any better as mere mortals rather than being a politician?
Believe me, we're mere mortals as well. But look, I think for me, when I go back to the Yes campaign, it was a hugely happy period for me, even though ultimately I was gutted, the day after and for days afterwards. In fact, my kids crept around the house as if, and you've maybe heard this before, as if there'd been a funeral, as if someone had died, and my kid was saying, "Would you like a cup of tea, Mum?" And they were looking after us because we were devastated, my partner and myself. We'd worked so hard, and in fact, our whole team in Edinburgh North on Leith had worked incredibly hard, as I'm sure you did as well. But one of the things that stands out for me from that day was the conversations we set up, and I was saying to Carolyn, actually, just walking along here, the difference between then and now is how much more politically engaged, politically aware and knowledgeable our people are now. I mean, there's not, leaving aside the fact there's so many more folk who can now advocate for us and part of the SNP or Greens or, non-party members, but people are so much more aware and they can pass that message, and we have an amazing group of people that can go out and spread this message and can counter all the rubbish arguments that they came up with last time. We're not going to let them get away with that this time. I mean, the Growth Commission report, I think, has a lot going for it. Yes, it's not the be-all and end-all by any means, but it was never meant to be. It was never meant to be, here's our position, it's fixed, and that's how we're doing it for years to come. This was a discussion paper. This is to get the ball rolling.
Start a conversation. Yeah,
start that conversation, but with something, factual behind it that we can. They haven't got anything like that. They've got nothing like that. So unless they're going to, who knows? Maybe they'll come out with something.
Another bus.
Yeah, a nice bus to put their messages on. But I think this time it's going to be very, the next referendum is going to be very different, and we have a lot more advantages this time. I'm looking forward to it. Yes. So basically, I know. See, I'm sort of thinking, a second independence referendum, but no, I think basically all of us have to be as knowledgeable as possible. So when all the muck starts getting thrown at us, as it will, and as it is still now, we are ready with the answers. That would be great. And just go out and talk to folk and find out why they're frightened. Usually the reasons are not very, they're ultimately not great reasons. We can easily tell them that, that's not so. Look at this. You can go and find out some independent advice from elsewhere. It doesn't, you go and read this book, or, it doesn't have to be just based on stuff that they read on social media, which, as we know, may well have been pumped out by something like a Cambridge Analytica, you know. Yes, sir.
You said that you feel there's a more awareness in the population. Do you think it's more awareness of what's going on, or is it more frustration with what has been going on?
I think what you're saying is that there's nothing really illegal going on here. It doesn't come under election rules in terms of expenditure. They can pretty much do what they like.
No, there's a civil service code. I mean, given that these people are civil servants,
Yeah.
they are employed by the civil service. They have to abide by that code.
Yeah.
And that is what we're contending that in some of these instances they are not doing. Now, getting them to respond to that is not easy. We've got a couple of plans, but I probably can't share them with you just yet, but I'll let you know when we make
That was another
move.
point I was going to make, was that I can't remember the woman's second name, Carol Cadwaller or something like that.
Yeah, Kawali, yeah, from The Guardian. She's doing amazing work.
From The Guardian. I mean, there's maybe a kind of thread there running in parallel with what you're doing to look at that targeting, because the targeting is just too sweet.
Yeah.
And it's Facebook and Twitter, which are the two Cambridge Analytica specialists.
We have asked questions. I mean, there was some work done with either Cambridge Analytica or I think it's the parent company SEL with the MOD, and the government has now admitted that they actually they were commissioned to do some work for them. But we actually asked questions regarding Cambridge Analytica and SEL of pretty much every single department, and most of them came back saying, no, we haven't. So, well, since that particular body was set up. That said, you know, there were organisations prior to SEL and Cambridge Analytica. You know, they tend to change their spots very quickly. I don't know if you've noticed, but now that is it SEL or Cambridge Analytica that's actually gone out of business? I can't remember.
It is.
Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge
Yeah, it is.
Analytica. So, but now some of the directors seem to have shifted to another organisation with a different name. So, yes, there are ways around these things, I'm sure. Yes, sir.
The figures and the scenario you painted with regard to the completely unacceptable and inappropriate use of public money, particularly when it's targeted in one direction only, which you outlined very carefully. How is it possible to bring that into the public domain? Because I would imagine that the vast majority of people in Scotland have no clue that that's going on.
Well,
I mean, you mentioned also that freedom of information reports were being reduced or excluded. Is it possible to bring stuff like that into the public?
Well, I mean, we had quite a bit of coverage in the National, for example, and we did get coverage in other areas as well. I think the Mirror and maybe the Canary and, you know, some other things as well. But you probably know yourself, trying to get traction in a lot of the media, particularly sort of mainstream media, is not easy. And I can assure you, we do everything we can to try and get it out there as much as we can. And actually, that's another thing that folk can do to help, you know, share on Facebook or social media, whatever you use, Instagram, whatever, try and share this as much as possible and get it out there, because I think that's how we start to get around that issue. But I can assure you, I mean, I know a lot of folk feel, I mean, sometimes, you know, we have some very good comms people, but they can attempt to get a press release into a paper as much as you like, but if the paper won't run it, if the editor spikes it, then you can't do anything with it. You can just then try to use alternative routes. The National is very good at picking up some of this stuff, and sometimes it's sufficiently big enough in the National that it, you know, kicks off into other papers. So some of that social media spend stuff was in the Times, for example, and one of the journalists there took an interest in it. So, you know, these are all helpful in raising awareness, and, you know, I think I would, you know, there are times when I see on social media someone mentioning that social media spend or the army of spin doctors, and I think, well, that's a contribution. You know, we have exposed something that was going on that the people of Scotland weren't aware of, so that's important. Yes, sir.
Hello, Deirdre. When John Nicholson went from here down to Westminster, he found some very odd, peculiar things. I mean, he found he had a coat hanger, I think, with a little ribbon on it for hanging his sword on.
Yes,
and in fact, he was presented with a plastic sword along the way here in Milngavie to hang on. I'm reminded that there are other oddities in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. There's somebody called the Remembrancer. And
Okay.
the remembrancer sits with a very long wig, and he sits in the shadow on the lee side of the speaker. And his function is purely to represent, he's a paid government lobbyist for the city, purely for the City of London.
Yeah. I haven't seen anyone sitting around in long wigs.
No, that's only a long wig.
Yeah,
must be
I
hiding.
mean, there is, no, I think you're right. Someone told me about this not so long ago, actually. It's not
There's
something
a
I've sort of stumbled across, but yes.
Coincidence about that.
Oh, yeah.
There was actually an 18th century paper called The Remembrancer. It was a Jacobite one.
Was there?
There's a picture by, I forget who, it was a well-known artist at the time about
Ramsey.
panic round London,
Yeah.
because they think about the Prince Charlie Army and that. And one of the people was there, I think it was a woman who's selling copies of this paper, The Remembrancer.
Was it?
Well, this remembrancer has a budget of £6.5 million, I think.
What?
Yes, and he has an office with paid officials. He's not allowed to speak. He's only allowed the ear of ministers and parliamentarians to make sure that the City of London, by the City of London I mean financial city, is represented. Now, surely to goodness, Mundell could have been a kind of remembrancer for Scotland. And only he'd had the same power. If we could have had him in a wig, getting into
Quiet,
politicians' ears saying, remember Scotland.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, they all talk a big game. I mean, Mrs. May's constantly going on about our precious, precious union, which, you know, frankly, kind of sickens me, because their treatment of Scotland, certainly Scottish MPs, most of us, is far from acting as if we're precious in any way at all. They're very rude and dismissive. I mean, some of the comments, I mean, Mrs. May's actually the worst when we send in written parliamentary questions. I mean, her replies are so brief as to be insulting, you know, it's really quite comical, I suppose, if she wasn't running a government in the United Kingdom. But yeah, no, the remembrance, I mean, it's such an odd place. You've probably seen Murray Black's speech on it. I haven't yet, because I mean, I lived through it, so I don't need to, but I believe it's fantastic. And, you know, genuinely we have the Sergeant at Arms, who's always got a sort of security or defence or police background, there in this 18th century frock coat, it's not a frock coat, it's just a coat, with a wig bag at the back of his head and a sword, this little dinky sword when he walks into the chamber. I mean, it just, you know, you know, when you're down there long enough, you just sort of think, oh, whatever. The thing that really drives me mad down there is the voting system. I go on about this all the time. In fact, I spoke to some school kids the other day, and I mean, you know, the Scottish government, the Scottish Parliament, put a card in, press a button, bang, there's your vote. I mean, it just must make for more nuanced legislation, you know, it must, because we take 20 minutes traipsing in and out of those lobbies, and sometimes votes, you know, if there's a series of votes, can take, you know, 2 hours. It's a complete waste of time. And the only argument they can muster in favour of it is, oh, you can catch a minister on his way through the lobby. And it's like, what kind of a government are you running if it's so difficult to catch your ministers? You have to run after them like kids running after a teacher or something. It's a bizarre system.
If you could distill your notes in some format or another, there's a couple of blogs. There's Bella Caledonia. We could go on to that as a, you know, a concerned citizen, and we've also got the Yes group that used to, it was based in Kirkintilloch basically, but they're gearing back up again. And Neil Scott, who's looking, I think, like a notional chair of that at the minute anyway. He runs a blog which has got a very good following. I think it's called Ungagged. And he would definitely be interested in something like that. And I would certainly go in as a concerned citizen.
Yeah, no, maybe I should speak to Bella, because he actually lives in the
things you're talking
constituencies.
about in terms of the Parliament don't surprise me at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's a whole ton of stuff that we might never know. I complained.
You know, without question.
I complained about Jo Swinson because I'd done quite a bit of research prior to the last election, because she quoted on the ballot paper their address was her parents' address.
Oh.
And as far as I can see, she lives somewhere there in Wiltshire. But this aside, I'm not interested in where she lives, and I've made that clear to everybody, but I did complain to the Electoral Commission saying, look, this just is fundamentally wrong. This woman's put this address on here, and she may well have lived there for the last 3 or 4 weeks to qualify. They came back to me and said, no, the returning officer is legally obliged to turn a blind eye to whatever the home address is put on the form as. If they want to say, I live on the moon, and they happen to be the MP's, respective MP's neighbour,
Okay.
they just have to go, yeah, Joe, and they carry on. And if you want to challenge it, the government have set it up in such a way that the only way it can be challenged is for a member of the public to go to the police and make a formal complaint. And that gives the right of the MP to then sue you for defamation.
All right.
Which automatically stops you, basically. Now, a separate issue about Joe Swinson came up and I actually mentioned it to the police in that interview. I must admit, their ears did prick up. They were quite interested, because I did a whole lot of research. For instance, 2 weeks before the election, she just managed to get herself onto the electoral register. She's got 3 companies that are listed. And it's definitely a jailable offence to lie to Companies House about where you live. And when you look at the 3 companies that Joe Swinson runs, they're all consultancies, and there's one about maternity rights and things. She does great stuff for women. I'm not knocking Joe Swinson from the women's point of view. But if you look at Companies House, all our residences are England. And that happened right through that election. She was still saying to Companies House, yes, I live in England, because she knew she could go to jail if she lied there.
Okay. Well, I didn't know about that, so I might...
So nothing surprises me about the Parliament, because the Parliament seems to have, kind of worked a lot of things out to suit themselves.
My goodness me. I mean, that's happened for centuries.
And Mary Black was excellent, by the way, listening to her process.
Yeah, I must catch
she made it into a real good comedy turn. It was good to watch, rather
can
than
I
being
tell you,
dry.
that girl is just amazing.
Yeah.
She is just such...
Plus the
What you
levels
see
of
with
abuse.
Mary is exactly what you get.
She
I
did
know all
a
the
fabulous
abuse she
job
got.
in the abuse. Absolutely fabulous. I mean, when
That speech was amazing.
Oh yeah, I mean, you could see everybody in the room cringing at the language she was using, but that's routine. That Nicola Sturgeon's getting that on her timeline all the time.
Oh, I know.
It's a disgrace.
I know.
Absolute disgrace.
Going off track with what we're
Sorry.
No, go for it,
Sorry.
But with Jo Swinson, she actually posted, I'm not on Twitter, but you can Google it and look up somebody, and she posted a photograph of her polling card on her way to vote, and it's her parents' address.
So I jumped, I literally jumped. I thought, my God, how brazen do you get?
How interesting.
And I've had to stress, because people go, why do you want to know where Jo Swinson lives? I'm saying, I don't want to know where Jo Swinson lives. But she's married on to the guy that used to be the MP for Wiltshire, and it's fair bet because we're interested in London. Absolutely.
Right, okay, that's very interesting, thank you. So I'll get some clarity around that and what the legal or otherwise implications are. Aye, okay, yeah, interesting. Okay, so... Yes, Donald.
You've noticed about the Scotland and Union, the revelations about Scotland and Union.
Revelations or?
Revelations, something like that. Well, anyway, the news that came out about the...
Oh, the funding.
Revelations, isn't it?
Who all the funders were.
Sorry?
The names that...
and the correspondence with the Electoral Commission and all the rest of it. And if you kind of follow the trail, you get to the final bit is the UK Government Communications Service. And it seems to be the whole coordinating body paid for by us for all the media output throughout the UK.
Where did you see this?
It's, Scotland and Union employed... I'll never get through this, but a lobbying company which was owned by one of the owners was Margaret McDonough, the previous Labour General Secretary.
Okay.
And another couple of Labour.
So this is a lobbying company
that Scotland and Union used. Well, it was more a strategy company to work out their strategy. Now, it was in the correspondence with the Electoral Commission. Thank you. Right, and so looked at looked that up, and of the 3 proprietors, one guy owned I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book. Anyway, he wrote a book about strategy, and he put in his blog, really glad that the UK Government Communications Service has now adopted the strategy of my book. I then looked up UK Government Communications Service on Google, and it said our remit is to change attitudes, to change people's behaviour. Change behaviour, not just attitudes.
Is this like the behavioural unit, the nudge unit? Is that got any connection to that? Because the UK government is started under Blair, I think. They started something called the nudge unit, which brings out some quite interesting papers about how you can use psychological knowledge of psychology to change people's behaviour. It's set up, I think, in the sort of last days of the Blair government, but it's continued. And I think it's kind of, we were just looking into this recently actually, it's worth a look at if you want to, do you want to see that? I think it's the UK Government Behavioural, again, I shall find out, but I wonder if it's got something to do with that.
That actually sounds very familiar to the Cambridge Analytica one.
Exactly.
Well,
Because they were saying, yes, you can use what you know about these people's likes and dislikes to nudge them in whatever direction you want them to go by targeting them with appropriate messages.
Yeah, I mean the big problem with them of course was that they actually took people's names. I mean I think this nudge unit is more about sort of nudging the populace into doing things that the government wants them to do. I'm sure with the very best of intentions. I'd be so cynical. Forgive me, it's all this time down in Westminster, you get that one. Sorry, yes sir.
Just when you were talking about Joe Swinson and all dressing, how does Blair do? He has so many houses, more than the royal family, and so many companies that he has. How does he keep the right side of the law about them?
You know, you'd have to. I don't know. I'm sure he has very, very good lawyers who keep him on the right side of whatever laws apply. But yeah, I couldn't say that unfortunately. Never having met the chap, actually.
You try to turn up at his door to ask him when you'll get beaten up.
Right.
Like Shannon.
Worse than Jeremy thought.
Jeremy thought. Yes.
Your very first sentence, you really shocked me because I suppose I was a bit stupid. I've never actually seriously thought of David Wendell and his employees, and it really shocked me that it was coming off the budget.
Yeah, it is.
You know, but I don't
It's a block grant. UK government gives it to the Scottish Secretary of State.
People are aware of these sorts of things.
No,
And
exactly.
you really need to get all this information out. Because I mean, I just was absolutely shocked when you said that.
Yeah. Maybe we need to, you know, I need to do an article or a piece that actually sort of sets some of this out, just making it really plain for folk, because you're right. I mean, I was surprised. I didn't realise. I don't know what I thought happened. I suppose I thought that the UK government just gave money to Mundell and then money to, but it actually all goes, it's channeled through Mr. Mundell's Secretary of State, and then, you know, he takes off what he needs and then it goes to the government.
He's using, the less we're actually getting.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, if he takes a decision that he wants to use another 5 million this year, then, you know, I don't think anyone can stop him. He probably just has to. I think the department sits within, sort of either attached to or within the Ministry of Justice, so he might have to check with the PermSec and whoever the Secretary of State there is, you know, for some kind of permission. But you know,
Boris Johnson's wanting a new plane. Could be an early Christmas present from David Mundell.
Yeah, that's not. You'd hope that people would be out on the streets arguing that wasn't a good idea, but you know, you never know, do you? It's amazing what folk put up with. But you know, I mean, Westminster has operated for so many years on keeping its secrets to itself. You know, it's you know, the whole, you know, when you walk into the place, it's designed to overawe you. Yeah. Now, I was lucky. I worked in Edinburgh Council for 7 years, and that is, you know, it's wood panelled. It's got a bit of gilt. It's got, you know, portraits of men largely staring down at you with chains around their necks and so on. So it's quite a formal setting. What someone like Carol Monaghan, our excellent Glasgow North West, I think she is the MP for, But you know, she was a physics teacher, and what she thought when she walked in, you know, that it's not a normal place to work in. You get used to it, and you get used to its ways, but you know, it likes to keep its secrets to itself, and you have to prize them out. You have to try to get them to modernise and to be something that ordinary folks can relate to, but they don't want that, of course. I mean, it's the Tories who, you know, and some of the Labour Party as well, who cling the most to these traditions and how important they are, and you know, we need to keep these going. I mean, I worked in the Scottish Parliament, and now I've worked in Westminster. I can tell you, I would 1,000 times more work in the Scottish Parliament. It's modern, things happen quickly. I mean, the contrast is pretty startling. They're really stuck in the mud down in Westminster.
We used to say if it's too transparent, you'll get funny.
Exactly. That is exactly it. They'd never admit it, but you know, let's face it. Yes, sir.
Just a quick one. Do you ever get comments from foreign politicians about the Yaboo carry-on in Westminster? You know, I mean,
I'm sad to say.
Why in our parliament you look at? It's conducted. There may be arguments, but there's none of this Yaboo. 30 people shouting you down.
No, I mean, you know, you should hear the Tories. See, every time Ian stands up, right, they've figured out that this is actually more effective. They think it puts him off more. Because when they were sort of howling at him, Ian being Ian, that gave him, you know, he was like, right, you know, and he'd get stuck in. They realise that what they need to do is when he stands up, they all groan. That's what they do when our party leader, when our group leader stands up, they groan. So rude. He just ignores them, and you know, you've seen him in action. He is terrific.
That ties directly to the social media feed, because any of these social media feeds with the Union Jack in them, that's exactly what they say about Nicola Sturgeon. Yeah. I've actually reported, like I was saying that earlier on, some of them are purporting to, you know, promoting violence, and that's just
like that, yeah. No, this is just groaning because they're trying to pretend he's really boring.
Yeah.
But actually, you know, sorry, between him and Corbyn, Ian wipes the floor with Corbyn. He's really not very good on his feet. No, that's me. But you know.
The thing at the time, back at the time when Ewan got elected to Westminster, I was down in the, you know, us with the party workers, but one thing that was said when she was quite introduced, that our agent John McAteer said about with the Tories, there was concerted horse laughing. It was.
It's a disgrace, really.
No, it is. One of the MPs spat at Winnie, I believe. They were horrible.
How do you expect the population to have good manners if they see their elected representatives behaving like this?
I mean, with relation to their behaviour and what other folks see, I'm afraid some of the. I've had feedback from some European politicians who come and go, oh, it's all very exciting. Our parliaments are so boring, you know. I don't think, well, you know, at least you can hear each other. I can't hear.
Was it rehearsed? It was asked.
Oh, no, that's obviously.
I mean, I suppose the Australian Parliament can be quite blunt at times. I don't know if you've ever seen people like Paul Keating in action, but
yes, I've heard.
Yeah. So he could be quite. The insults go to a different level in Australia, I have to say. Usually involves talking about someone's mother, which is very inappropriate. Anyway, yes, sorry, ma'am, you were saying.
Well, I was really just going to point out how disrespectful it is, not only to the politicians, but to the people of Scotland, because they're, you are our representatives down in Westminster, and you're being treated with disrespect. But also, there's the whole power business that really is very worrying. You know, we are such a very small nation, and they have so much power. Really, we go for another referendum. Are we just going to get no, you're not getting it? And then what do we do?
That is above my pay grade, that particular answer that you'd be needing from that one. But I personally look at smaller countries of the world, such as Denmark, and some of the ones referenced in the Growth Commission, and I just think, why can't we do that? Why can't we do that? Of course we can. We've got more resources than most of those small countries that are doing much better than the UK in terms of general happiness of the population, you know, high GDP. I mean, so many areas they are doing better than us, and That is one area I would really like us to focus on, is looking at these other countries and saying, why can't we be like that? Why do we have to be tied to, I mean, the more that the UK sinks into the Brexit morass, and it is sinking beneath the weight of what it's taken on, the more I think, oh, for goodness sake, we have to get away from this. I mean, I just get stronger in that belief all the time. And I know a lot of colleagues are as well. Sorry.
Sorry, so getting on that point about power, where the power rests, and you know, David Mundell clearly thinks that his job is to represent the UK government in Scotland, but it's also his job to represent Scotland in the Cabinet. And I would have thought that the Scottish Affairs Committee was about holding him accountable on that. So how can it come about that the SNP isn't the majority party on the committee?
On the Scottish Affairs Committee? Well, it's because they have this strange way of, I mean, it's all decided behind clerks and procedures committee and what have you. We actually were only entitled, given that we've had this drop in numbers to 35, despite the fact we're the third largest party, originally we were only entitled to one, and that would have been Pete Wishart, the convener. And I think one of the Labour group decided not to take their seats, and I can't remember the exact arithmetic, but anyway, it happened that because we'd had 4 in the previous committee, that they recognise it would be ridiculous not to have a reasonable amount of SNP representation on there. And so far, you know, we have our differences, clearly, on committee, but when it comes to reports, barring a couple of stooshies, they've been, you know, even they have had to... I mean, they say that the committees are where you get the better amount of cross-party working. I have to say, even though I'm a great believer in cross-party working, it's not something you encounter very much down there, certainly not very much in the Parliament, the House of Commons chamber itself, but on the committees, people can be a bit more reasonable, and you can have a more detailed debate about a subject, you know, particularly behind closed doors when people aren't grandstanding for the cameras, you know. So, you know, so I mean, we brought out, I tell you what, the next inquiry we're doing, which is going to be really interesting, is on Scotland the brand and international trade and Brexit and how it's going to affect everyone. I think that is going to be absolutely fascinating, because there is a lot to come out from that. We're already hearing, aren't we, from NFUS, I think that was on the radio this morning, wasn't it, about they're starting to realise the impact that this is all starting. Well, I mean, we've already had a lot of evidence around this because we did an inquiry in immigration. That report's coming out shortly as well. We've done ones on RBS closures and ATMs and you know, a number of quite useful areas. And we had a reasonable response from the UK government to the RBS, not the RBS closures. It was one around work and sort of sustainability of work in the future in Scotland, sort of taking into account the Taylor review of working practices and so on. And somewhat to our surprise, we received quite a warm response to it. I'm not quite sure how to take it. We'll see whether that actually eventuates in them, you know, taking it into account in their actions. But you know, we'll see. But generally speaking, you know, computer says no on the reports that the committee does. I'm going to have to. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to get a train at. What is it? 9:09. I think I've got to head off to the station. But that gentleman up there's got a question.
Right. Since you're mentioning Scotland, the brand, we're continually told that 60% of Scotland's exports go to England. We might go through England, but I don't believe 60-odd% are consumed in England. Especially when you get somebody like the Scotch Whisky Association, who are no friends with SNP, saying that 93% of their output is exported overseas, which is obviously doesn't include England. If you can get such a high brand, the Scotch Whisky, so important to their exports, putting out 93% overseas, I just can't see how we can get 60% being consumed in England. Going through England, going through English ports, yes, but we need to rubbish this idea that England takes 63%, 64%.
I mean, all of that stuff.
Four times the EU exporting, they're always on about that.
Well, I mean, these are the sorts of things that we were hoping we'll get. I mean, you do get good evidence sessions, and we'll probably, I'm certain we'd get the SWA coming up before us to talk about this. But you know, one thing, here's a point. The biggest food stuff exported out of Heathrow is Scottish salmon. So I don't know why. Well, I understand it's got something to do with freezers or large enough freezers or something, but that is, per tonnage, the single largest food stuff exported from Heathrow.